So you're working with epoxy resin. What kind of epoxy resin should you use? There's actually a lot of different types of epoxy resins to use in different type of industries and different type of projects that you might be working on. Let's first start with standard epoxy resin. This is the most basic and versatile of all epoxy resins. It's typically used in projects where you're doing woodworking, jewelry making, or just arts and crafts projects. The second type of epoxy resin that you might be using is called casting epoxy resin. This type of epoxy resin is used for casting large objects, sculptures, mold, or tabletops. Casting epoxy resin has low viscosity. Is that how you say that word? Viscosity? Casting epoxy resin has low viscosity. That makes it ideal for making long-term molds, doing these more intricate designs. The third epoxy resin you might come across is UV resistant epoxy resin. This type of epoxy resin is designed to resist against yellowing and fading under sunlight. This type of epoxy resin is typically used outdoor, working with patio furniture, signs, or maybe you're dealing with something on like your fence or other outdoor structures. The fourth kind of epoxy resin you might be using is high temperature epoxy resin. Why would you use high temperature epoxy resin? When you work in the automotive industry or aerospace industry, you will want to use high temperature resistant epoxy resin. In these environments, you're going to be dealing with high temperatures. The fifth kind is water resistant epoxy resin. Because it's water resistant epoxy resin, you're going to be using this in like marine industry. Basically, if you're dealing with anything on boats, jet skis, or anything that might touch the water and you need water resistant epoxy resin, this is where you use water resistant epoxy resin. Next, let's talk about structural epoxy resin. Structural epoxy resin is used in the construction industry. It's used for concrete platforms. It's going to be used on steel, anything that you might need very strong, heavy reinforced resin. That's where you're going to use structural epoxy resin. Now, the final one, food grade epoxy resin. So if you are dealing in food storage containers, food storage bags, anything that might touch food, you will want to use a food grade epoxy resin when you're designing and making these food grade containers. If you found these tips about epoxy resin helpful, go ahead and click the like button down below or click subscribe or follow. We much appreciate it. It allows us to make sure that we're continuing to provide you valuable content that you can use when you go and do your epoxy resin work.